The dying embers of the sunset bled across the Montana sky like a wound that wouldn't heal, much like the one Xavier Galloway carried inside his chest. It had been exactly 1 year since he'd laid his wife Olivia to rest beneath the old cottonwood tree that overlooked their modest ranch. 1 year since he'd dug a hole deeper than necessary and placed not just her body, but his heart alongside it. Xavier stared out across the barren landscape from his porch, a glass of whiskey untouched in his weathered hand. At 32, his face had aged a decade in a single year, lines etching themselves around his eyes like the dried creek beds that cut through his property. The drought of 1878 had taken not just the water, but seemingly all life from this corner of Montana territory. "Mr. Galloway?" A voice, feminine and unfamiliar, pulled him from his thoughts. Xavier squinted against the fading light. A figure on horseback approached his homestead, a woman, her silhouette unfamiliar against the vast emptiness of the land. "Private property," he called out, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his side. The rider drew closer, and Xavier could make out more details now. She was dressed practically for the trail brown riding pants, a white shirt beneath a leather vest, her blonde hair tied back in a simple braid. Not the typical attire for a woman in these parts, but the West made its own rules. "I know," she replied, pulling her horse to a stop. "My name is Ophelia Sawyer. I've come from Kansas City with a letter from your wife's sister." Xavier's jaw tightened. "Margaret's dead. Cholera took her last winter." The woman Ophelia dismounted with practiced ease. "I know that too. I was her neighbor. She gave me this before she passed." She reached into her saddlebag and produced an envelope, yellowed and worn from travel. Xavier made no move to take it. "Whatever it says, it's too late. There's nothing for you here." Ophelia stood her ground, dust swirling around her boots. "I promised a dying woman I'd deliver this, Mr. Galloway. I don't break promises." Something in her tone, determination without aggression, gave Xavier pause. He descended the porch steps and took the letter, the paper rough against his calloused fingers. "There's water in the well for your horse," he said gruffly. "You can rest here tonight. Town's another day's ride west." She nodded her thanks and led her horse toward the small corral. Xavier returned to the porch and broke the seal on the letter. Margaret's handwriting, once as familiar to him as Olivia's, filled the page. "Xavier, by the time you read this, I will be gone, just like my dear sister. I fear the Galloway name will die with you if you continue on your current path. Olivia would not want this for you, brother. She would not want you to bury yourself alongside her memory. The bearer of this letter, Ophelia Sawyer, is a woman of remarkable character and strength. She has agreed to travel west with something precious to you, something Olivia sent to me before her passing that I believe you should have. Please, Xavier, for Olivia's sake and for your own, listen to what Ophelia has to say." With eternal love, Margaret. Xavier folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. A heaviness settling over him that had nothing to do with the approaching night. He watched as Ophelia tended to her horse, her movements efficient and practiced. No city woman, this one. When she approached the house again, Xavier had prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "Thank you," she said, accepting the plate. "Not many men can cook out here." "Not many men have had to learn," he replied. "My wife taught me before she—" He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. Ophelia ate quietly, respecting his silence. When she finished, she placed her plate aside and met his gaze directly. "Margaret told me about Olivia," she said, "about how you two met during the war, how you built this place together, and about how the fever took her last spring." Xavier's fingers tightened around his glass. "Margaret talked too much. She also told me what you said at the funeral." Ophelia's voice softened. "That you buried your heart with your wife." "Not just words," Xavier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Truth." Ophelia reached into her pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in cloth. "Olivia sent this to Margaret before she died. Your sister-in-law thought you should have it." Xavier unwrapped the bundle with hesitant fingers. Inside lay a small journal bound in faded leather, its pages worn and marked with Olivia's neat script. "She knew she was dying," Ophelia said quietly. "The last pages are for you." Xavier stared at the journal but couldn't bring himself to open it. "Why did you really come all this way, Miss Sawyer?" "A promise to a dying woman isn't enough to send someone across half the country." Ophelia's blue eyes met his without wavering. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, Mr. Galloway, and I know what it's like to find a reason to live again." That night, Xavier lay awake in his bed, Olivia's journal unopened beside him. He could hear Ophelia moving about in the spare room across the hall, the room that was supposed to have been for the children he and Olivia never had the chance to conceive. When dawn broke, Xavier found Ophelia already awake, tending to the few chickens that remained in his neglected coop. "You don't have to do that," he said, uncomfortable with her assistance. "I know," she replied, scattering feed on the ground. "But idle hands make poor companions. Did you read the journal?" Xavier shook his head. "Some things are better left buried." Ophelia stopped what she was doing and faced him directly. "Mr. Galloway, I didn't ride all this way to watch you continue to die by inches." "What would you have me do?" he asked, anger finally breaking through his carefully constructed walls. "Forget her? Move on as if she never existed?" "No," Ophelia said calmly. "I would have you honor her by living the life she wanted for you, the life she writes about in those pages you refuse to read." Xavier turned away, but Ophelia's words followed him. "If you've truly buried your heart with your wife, Mr. Galloway, then let me dig it up." The boldness of her statement stopped him in his tracks. "You don't know what you're asking." "I think I do," she replied. "I'm asking you to be brave enough to feel something again, even if it's just pain." That afternoon, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing the first real rain the area had seen in months. Xavier and Ophelia worked together to secure the livestock and property against the coming deluge. As thunder cracked overhead, they made a dash for the house, both soaked to the skin by the time they reached the porch. "That's the most alive I've felt in a year," Ophelia laughed, wringing water from her braid. Xavier found himself almost smiling at her unbridled joy over something as simple as rain. It reminded him painfully of Olivia's similar delight in small pleasures. Inside, Xavier lit the stove and hung their wet clothing near it to dry. Ophelia, wrapped in a blanket, settled into a chair by the fire. "Tell me about her," she said suddenly. "Tell me about Olivia." Xavier stiffened. "Why would you want to hear about that?" "Because she's still part of you," Ophelia answered. "And if I'm going to help you find your heart again, I need to know where to look." Perhaps it was the storm or the strange comfort of a sympathetic ear, but Xavier found himself talking. Slowly at first, then with increasing animation, he told Ophelia about meeting Olivia during the war when he was a young cavalry officer, and she was a nurse. How they'd married against her parents' wishes and headed west to start a new life. How they'd built the ranch together, working side by side until the day she fell ill. "She loved this land," Xavier said, looking out at the rain-soaked landscape. "Said it reminded her that life finds a way, even in the harshest conditions." "She sounds like she was very wise," Ophelia observed. "She was everything," Xavier said simply. That night, after Ophelia had retired to her room, Xavier finally opened Olivia's journal. His hands trembled as he turned to the final pages. "My dearest Xavier, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are most likely doing exactly what I feared, shutting yourself away from the world. I know you too well, my love. Your capacity for devotion is matched only by your stubbornness. I need you to understand something. When I said my heart was yours forever, I did not mean for you to bury it with me. Our love was never meant to be your prison, but your strength. Live, Xavier, not just exist, but truly live. Find joy again. find purpose, and yes, when you are ready, find love. You have too much to offer this world to lock it away in grief. Remember our promise under the stars? That we would never hold each other back from living fully? I am holding you to that promise now. Forever yours, Olivia. Xavier closed the journal, tears streaming down his face for the first time since the funeral. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away a year's worth of dust and neglect from the land. The next morning, Ophelia found Xavier digging in the garden that had lain fallow since Olivia's death. "What are you doing?" she asked, watching as he turned the rain-softened soil. "Planting," he replied simply. "Olivia always wanted sunflowers here." Ophelia stepped forward and took a second shovel from where it leaned against the fence. Without a word, she began working alongside him. By midday, they had prepared the entire garden bed. Xavier stood back, surveying their work with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in months. "You're good at this," he said to Ophelia. She smiled. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri before moving to Kansas City. Dirt under my fingernails feels more natural than ink stains." "You said you lost everything," Xavier ventured. "What happened?" Ophelia's smile faded. "The war. Confederate raiders burned our farm in '63. My parents and younger brother didn't make it out." She paused, her gaze distant. "I was 17. Worked as a seamstress in St. Louis until I saved enough to buy a small place in Kansas City. That's where I met Margaret." Xavier nodded, understanding the weight of her loss. "Yet here you are, still planting gardens. What else is there to do?" she asked simply. "The world doesn't stop turning just because our hearts break." Over the next several days, Ophelia showed no signs of continuing her journey westward, and Xavier found he didn't want her to. Together, they began repairing the ranch-fixing fences, mending the roof, clearing irrigation channels to take advantage of the recent rains. In the evenings, Xavier would read more from Olivia's journal, sharing some passages with Ophelia. Through Olivia's words, he began to see his grief not as a monument to their love, but as a barrier to honoring her memory properly. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Xavier turned to Ophelia. "Why did you really come here? The truth this time." Ophelia was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret showed me your letters to Olivia, the ones you wrote during the war." She met his gaze. "I've never seen love like that expressed in words before. When she told me about what happened to Olivia and how you'd withdrawn from life, I couldn't bear the thought of such a capacity for love being lost to the world." Xavier studied her face in the fading light. "That's still not an answer." "Maybe I came because I needed to believe that kind of love could exist," she admitted. "Maybe I needed to see if hearts can truly be unburied." 2 weeks after Ophelia's arrival, a band of cattle rustlers hit the neighboring Thompson Ranch. The news came via a breathless young ranch hand who rode up just before dusk. "They took everything, Mr. Galloway," the boy explained. "Shot Mr. Thompson when he tried to stop them. Mrs. Thompson sent me to warn the other ranches in the valley." Xavier's jaw set in a hard line. "How many?" "6 men," the boy replied, headed south toward the border, trailing about 30 head. Xavier nodded grimly. "Tell Sheriff Mills I'll meet him and whoever else he can gather at Crooked Creek Crossing at dawn." After the boy left, Xavier began checking his rifle and revolver, his movements practiced and efficient. "You're going after them," Ophelia said. It wasn't a question. "Thompson was a good man," Xavier replied. "Those cattle are all his widow has left." Ophelia watched him prepare, her expression unreadable. Finally she said, "I'm coming with you." Xavier looked up sharply. "No, you're not." "I can shoot," she countered. "Probably better than half the men the sheriff will gather." "That's not the point," Xavier argued. "These men are killers." "All the more reason you'll need every capable gun," she insisted. "Besides, I've dealt with their kind before." Something in her tone made Xavier pause. What do you mean? Ophelia's eyes hardened.